Hello, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, you can take the screen share off, I think.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. So you want me to go on for a few minutes about what I wrote about? Okay. Well, um, a couple of years ago, I was invited by uh, Eric Olin, right? Who was a very prominent sociologist and who has passed away, unfortunately, to the University of Wisconsin uh, as a visiting fellow. Uh, and since I had a background of being what they call a public intellectual and an activist, he asked me to, could I write while I was there, about my life. And I wrote about many things, but I didn't write about my life because I was not feeling that I had really anything significant to write about. And then a few years later, a good friend of mine, Professor Richard Falk, who used to be the special rapporteur on the occupied territories, Palestinian territories for the United Nations. Again, asked me if why not write something about your political life, and I said thank you, but I really don't think there's anything much to write about. And finally, when I was in Kyoto, like as a visiting senior research fellow back in uh, late 2022, Professor Carol Howe, who is a very prominent literary figure in the Philippines, asked me, well, now that you're here, you're going to write about your life, right? And I said, well, so I wrote her a long note um, to explain why I was sort of apprehensive. So the long and short of that note is while, according to standard um, evaluations of people about individuals, I might be considered, quote unquote, an individual success, mainly because of the writings that I have done on the Philippines, um, on global issues. I uh, I felt that um, I was failure. And the reason I was a failure, I thought, was because I was involved with two movements that didn't go well. And my life was pretty much tied up as an activist with these two movements. The one first movement was what we call the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines, which was a progressive anti-imperialist movement that led the resistance to the Marcos dictatorship back in the 1970s and 1980s. And the other movement, which is also of which the National Democratic Movement is, a part of in a broader historical sense, was the movement for socialism, and which for a long time was identified with the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, uh, and with Marxism-Leninism. So I was part of this broader movement in terms of my identification. So basically, what happened, and we can talk about this later, is that the Philippine Revolutionary Movement was, um, uh, shall we say, that it was derailed. Uh, and in fact, the aspirations that many of us had didn't come true in terms of taking hold of our national destiny and promoting social justice and uh, progressive um, uh, um, system, especially for workers and peasants. That did not succeed. And we all know that the Soviet Union and the Eastern European socialist countries collapsed in 1989, 1990, 1991. So since my life had been so tied up with these two movements, and my identity was basically part of a collective identity, their failure was my failure. And that's why I thought that, you know, why write about failure? Uh, and but since Carol was a good friend, I said, okay, I'll start, see if I can write something. And then I began to think and write. And as I began to think and write and think, I began to realize that, well, uh, why does one write um, a memoir or an autobiography in the first place? It, you know, sure, you may consider yourself a failure because of two movements that failed, but is that really the reason that people write? And I began to realize that basically people uh, write because they have an experience to communicate, whether or not, you know, that experience, um, is something that grabs people or repels people. But the important thing is people write because, you know, they write because they have to write. Uh, and that's when I began to write for 6 months. Um, my only companion in writing was basically um, uh, I whiskey, uh, fine blended whiskey, and running. And there's no more beautiful place to run than in Kyoto. And so this combination of writing, whiskey, and running was something that I followed for 6 months as I traveled from Kyoto to Bangkok to the United States and that sort of thing. And after 6 months, I was able to finish it. And I began to realize after that that, hey, sure, the movement in the Philippines might have been derailed for different reasons, and the Soviet Union and might have collapsed, and China might have become a capitalist country. But it wasn't all losses. I was part of the anti-globalization movement back in the 1990s and the 2000s, and I was part of all the great mobilizations from Seattle, okay, which was big, Genoa, Prague. We hounded neoliberalism and globalization all along the way, and those were long, hot summers of confrontation. And in the end, partly because of our efforts, neoliberalism and globalization, were discredited. And it wasn't just because of their internal contradictions, but it was because of people's movements, like the the key point in the reversal of neoliberalism and globalization was the collapse of the ministerial here in Seattle back in December of 1999. And that was that basically was because of a synergy of people out in the streets, 50,000 of us, and the developing country delegates at the Seattle Convention Center. Um, uh, that combination brought down the World Trade Organization's ministerial. And I do remember that very well because, when we went out in the morning, very rainy morning of late November, and we had different clumps of people sitting down on the entrances and exits of major hotels in the Seattle Convention Center. And the police came in and started to whack us. And, this developed into a full-scale police riot. And I was fortunate because I was trying to shield my friend, Millie Benjamin, that I saw was being attacked by a very burly policeman. And something snapped in me, and I tried to stop the policeman from hitting her. And I was grabbed from behind by another policeman who started to hit me with a club and then threw me several feet away like I was a leaf. And when I looked back, the policeman has his visor off, and I saw that it was a policewoman that had, grabbed me and thrown me away like I was a leaf, and started to pursue me. And I was able to escape. My head was able to escape the blows, but my body wasn't. And later on, it began to. But the situation is that there was a combination of people resisting on the streets, developing country delegates resisting at the Seattle Convention Center, and then a police riot. And these were the elements that went together to make the first major reversal of globalization and the neoliberalism. So Donald Trump, one of these days, is going to start claiming that he's the one who stopped the WTO, that he's the one who stopped globalization, but don't believe that. We first stopped globalization and neoliberalism here in Seattle, and then in Genoa and in Prague and in Cancun. And it was, the movement against globalization was global, and it was eventually a win for our side. And nobody thinks globalization is a good thing these days. But it was our movement that pointed this out, that we were being sold a bunch of goods that was rotten, and that it was important to resist. And resist we did. And without that people's resistance, like what happened in Seattle, globalization would not have been stopped, because there were a lot of studies, even before Seattle, 1999, that showed that globalization was creating poverty, inequality, stagnation. But these were basically in the realm of factoids from the perspective of the reigning ideology. After Seattle, what happened was that people like Joseph Stiglitz, George Soros, Jeffrey Sachs, these very prominent people began to defect from the globalist camp and began to retreat and begin to say that, hey, there are problems with globalization. Now, what made these people do that? And eventually, whole, even the media, academics began to desert and began to accept the fact that globalization was leading to something very different from what had been promised by the corporations and the economists. It was action. The only thing that, without action, there can be no real truth. And a truth really gets ratified by action. That's why it's very important to be an activist, because activism is really what creates the truth. I mean, not only activism, but it's a combination of facts and active resistance. So that was when I began to write. I said, "Oh, right. We this was very important to record this." And the other win that we had, okay, was we helped, stop the U.S. empire. Many of us in the anti-globalization movement were also parts of the movement against the Iraq War. If people remember, this, early 21st century, the United States was, this unipolar power. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and George Bush and his people began to, this ambition of remaking the world in the image of the United States by using military force. And they invaded Afghanistan, they invaded Iraq, but they met up with resistance from people, and and I have to say that that the United States got bogged down in the Middle East in a 20-year war that went nowhere, and finally got defeated in Afghanistan. And that was very important. And there were different forces that brought that together, including Osama bin Laden, that of course we would, horrified by what his actions were. But it was more than that. It was people resisting on the ground, and it was the anti-imperialist, anti-empire movement, in the global South and the global North. So I just wanted to say that, this was a movement that I was also involved with. I went to Iraq right before the American invasion with several people from Asia. And, we were crazy enough to think that our being there would stop the Americans from coming into Baghdad. And, we had, this experience of in a society where young people were basically expecting the worst, and yet saying that even if the Americans come, we are going to resist and they won't win. And they were right. And in the process, I myself also got involved in, anti-Israeli actions, went to Lebanon, and, where we met the different forces of the resistance. And this was a very broad resistance. There were, all sorts of different groups that, were trying to stop the Israeli expansionism, that was destroying, the Palestinian people and destabilizing the whole of the Middle East. So this expansionist, settler, colonial, genocidal regime, I mean, there was no way, but you had to be part of the resistance to that. And we have to, it's been so many decades, but, we can't give up on that. But nevertheless, I guess my point is that we were able to stop the United States, reverse the process of imperialism to the point that although the United States remains a big threat to the world, nevertheless, the what happened to the U.S. in the Middle East, which was a massive reversal, in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Again, it was mainly a people's resistance that stopped that. The point is that when I look back and began to write, I said, hey, you know, we had our losses, but we also had our wins. And it is important to both examine the losses and why we failed, and also examine the wins, why we won. And that's what I wrote about. After 6 months, the book was done, and of course, I also write about my own personal life and crisis. Because if you're going to write a memoir, why just write about good things, right? You might as well write about everything, the good and the bad, and the good, the bad, and the ugly, as our friend Clint Eastwood would say. Because if you're just going to write, an airbrush kind of personal and political history, you might not as well write. Okay? So I think there are many things that might be politically incorrect in what I wrote, but hell, why not? Just let it out there, as they say. So basically, that's what this book is about. And the only thing that I would like to say is what led me into this path of activism, because I was really an accidental activist. I came to the United States in 1969, determined to be a professional sociologist. And in 1970, I was walking down the street in Princeton University, and there was a commotion across the street at a place called the Institute for Defense Analysis. And I got very curious. I said, oh, I might as well derail myself for a bit, because I was rushing to a methodology class, and on campus. And then there were, about 25 people that were seated. It was a sit-down strike to prevent people from entering the Institute of Defense Analysis that was doing contract work for the Pentagon, and basically involved in the war machine. So when the police came and started to break up the sit-in, I suddenly found myself among the people that were doing the sit-in. And I found myself beside a very prominent diplomatic historian, Arno Mayer, the most prominent diplomatic historian then, and he was seated with the rest of us and students. And on my right was a very prominent Latin American historian, the most prominent American Latin American historian, Stanley Stein. I didn't get to know their identities then, but only afterwards. And of course, we were all arrested, and and that. So basically, if I hadn't stepped into that ring of people that were doing the sit-in, I would have had a different career track, because I was a foreign student, and at that point in time, they were very strict with what foreign students could do. If you got involved politically, that meant you were going to be deported. So in the split second in which I find myself moved from being a bystander towards an activist, I suddenly realized that I had given up my academic career. But the important thing, though, is that I felt good about it. That somehow I had made the leap from being an intellectual observer, maybe progressive or liberal, but nevertheless, I had made the leap to become an activist. So I was waiting and waiting and waiting for the deportation order, but it never came. And then I realized that this was pre-2001, before the Department of Homeland Security consolidated all the arrest records of people in the United States. There was no coordination between the Princeton police and the Immigration and Naturalization Service, as it was then called. So that lack of coordination saved my academic career. But I was never the same since then, because from then I became mainly an activist. Yes, I still did my academic work, but you know, it's for a long time, whenever I would enter the United States, you show your passport, and ever since the Department of Homeland Security consolidated everything, the immigration agent would push a button, and up would come all my arrest record in the United States. And they would always look at me and say, how come you are so arrested? And what did you do? And so I had to explain that that was a very different time. We were fighting this, we were fighting a dictatorship, that sort of thing, that sort of thing. So anyway, that event, to which the sit-in at the Institute of Defense Analysis took place when Nixon and Kissinger invaded Cambodia in the May of 1970. So the irony of this whole thing is that who do I owe my becoming an activist to? It was to Kissinger and to Nixon, two guys that will go down in infamy. And I would say last year, when Kissinger died at 100, I wrote an article when I wrote basically that I hate this guy, but I have to say one thing. He's the guy who made me an activist. So life is full of ironies, and all of that is in the book. I wish I could summarize it, but those were the high points. So thank you for listening to this crazy narrative of an accidental activist.
Thank you so much. I can imagine that there's a lot more in there to be found in the book, and in you. And I wrote down approximately 10 questions, but I want to open it up for the audience. First, thank you, Walden, for that great summary. It was very evocative, and I'm hoping that the audience has a bunch of questions, and if not, I will ask mine. So people can put questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand, whatever works best for you. It always takes everyone a minute to warm up. And also, it's the end of our quarter and everyone's pretty sleepy. Okay. Well, I'll ask one of my many questions. Well, actually, Maybe I'll ask something that Erica Owen, who is here with us. I'm glad you're here, Erica. We're just talking about before I got on the Zoom. There's interesting news out of the Philippines of late. And hi, Erica. And I wonder if you want to talk about that, Walden, at all, and to talk a little bit about what's happening in the Philippines and how you connect it to your identity and your book and your story.
Oh, yes. Well, the former president of the Philippines got arrested, uh, and an arrest warrant that was served on him by Interpol, and that came from, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and he was surrendered by the Philippine government to the ICC, and he's now in The Hague, and he will be tried for the killing of about 27,000, if not more, Filipinos in a drug war. All these people were extrajudicially executed at his command, using the police in the Philippines. So many of us were part of, you know, the critics of his regime. During that time, I would write and post things, criticizing the absolute lawlessness that he was involved with. I was engaged in trying to get a very fine person, the former Secretary of Justice in the Philippines, Laila de Lima, who was unjustly imprisoned by him because she wanted to investigate his human rights violations, both as the former mayor of Davao and the president of the Philippines. It was a terrible, dark period. And he had her framed and said that she really was part of the drug cartel in the Philippines, which was absolutely crazy. So, I was involved in an effort over a couple of years to, so many of us were trying to get her out of this. And finally, in 2022, she was released because there was no evidence at all against her. It was pure frame up. But the bigger part, of course, is just the way that 27,000 people were just offed. No due process, nothing. And so Duterte really had it coming. And I'm very happy that he's out of the country and he's going to be tried. And that he's never going to get back to the Philippines again. So it's, we do have, people in the Philippines are extremely happy about this, although of course he still has his base of people that think he did no wrong. But nevertheless, I think that this was a milestone, a landmark, a monumental move in the protection of human rights. I was on Amy Goodman's show, America Democracy Now, yesterday, where we talked extensively about these issues that had to do with his arrest. Now, of course, there's dynastic warfare going on in the Philippines between the Marcos family, of which the president is part, Bongbong Marcos, and the Dutertes. And one cannot divorce politics from this. But and as for me, I have utter contempt for both the Marcoses and the Dutertes. And the world would be better served if these two clans disappeared from the face of the earth. But nevertheless, let me just say that the Philippines government, by being a contracting party to the Rome Statute that established um, the International Criminal Court, had a permanent obligation to comply with a court order, the rent uh, basically serving the arrest warrant to Duterte and sending him to The Hague. That was a responsibility that the Philippine government undertook when it signed the treaty. Whatever we think maybe about the temporary holders of political power, like the Marcoses, their obligation is to execute a permanent responsibility incurred by the Philippine state. So I would just like to say that yes, there's politics involved, but there's also a duty of a state that signed a treaty that says that you must hand over people accused of massive human rights violations, including those that border on genocide. And what Duterte did in the Philippines is, in fact, a major, massive human rights violations that bordered on genocide. So that's why things have been so tumultuous over the last several days. But let me just say that, oh my God, I'm really glad that the court was able to get its hands on this guy. He will be subjected to he will have his day in court. He will be, his rights will be respected. And this is much more than he gave his victims. I mean, his victims never had a chance for due process. They just were slaughtered, you know, uh, like animals. Um, so, um, uh, so that's just what I'd like to say at this point. I have a, I just wanted to say that the camp of the vice president, the daughter, Sara Duterte, lodged a complaint of cyber libel against me. I was charged with cyber libel. And I have to go down to the city of Davao every month because the case, I'm still on trial, but the Philippine system is so backlogged that they can only afford to give me 1 day out of a month to be tried for my case. So what could I say except that, that that I I I I hope that they get into their right minds and just drop this case against me, because it is a hassle having to go down to the city of Davao. That's their stronghold every month, and having to get permission from the judge to leave the country every time I have to go out to do something. So it's a big hassle, but it's a hassle that's little compared to the terrible uh, tragedies that have been inflicted on thousands of Filipinos by the orders of this man. So that's what I can say about what's happening.
Thank you. I hope that everybody takes some time to, if you haven't read anything about what's happening with Duterte, it's worth knowing more about. And then Greta put a link to the Democracy Now! In the chat, and we'll put that on the COSI website also. Other questions are coming in. Tiff Barba Padilla, hi Tiff, I hope I meet you someday, is a librarian at South and says that they don't have a question, but just wanted to express appreciation for what you said about activism, that activism creates truth. I also loved that. And then Tracy has a question in the chat. I will read it. Tracy's question is, what lessons from your experiences do you hope that today's movements can apply to fighting fascism and building democratic movements?
Well, I think the important thing is we have to have a combination of really analyzing what we have, what we're up against, and not to just engage in rhetoric about, say, the Trump administration and what it's doing. We've got to analyze why exactly it has gained the allegiance of, so many millions of Americans. And then from that analysis, we basically formulate a strategy on how to meet the rising fascist threat, not only in the United States, but in Europe and in the global South. And I think that process will be a trial and error kind of thing. But we have to engage in it. And the important thing is a combination of analysis and being out there as activists to fight it. So informed action, I think, is going to be key. And it's, let me just say this, that one of the things we really need to figure out here is the anti-globalization movement really created the critique of globalization, of corporate-driven globalization. And we pointed out the flaws of globalization. And how it was making things so difficult for working people all over the world. And yet, who benefited from the analysis that we begun was the far right. And basically, they took our arguments but applied it in a context that was so different from our politics. And basically, they said, yes, globalization is making life difficult for people, for workers, and but it's not only this corporate globalization, it's also the migrants and the immigrants and that sort of thing. So they put together a fascist kind of analysis and took what was our analysis, but put it in a context that was horrible. Okay, but they were able to hijack the anti-globalization agenda, and the reason they were able to hijack the anti-globalization agenda was because progressive parties, liberal parties, including the Democratic Party leadership in the United States, basically adopted neoliberalism, or what do they call it? Market fundamentalism with a human face. And because of that, they lost members. The Labour Party in Britain, the SPD in Germany, the Democratic Party in the United States, their working class base went over to the right. So we have to understand this process as we begin to figure out the strategy and the mass resistance that really we need to do. And we have to be very realistic that we have to reverse this tide, which has momentum at this point. And let's not kid ourselves. It has momentum because it does have popular support. But we just have to realize that we'll be able to do it. however it happens, we will be able to do it because eventually people will see the light. But we have to put our bodies on the line. And that's why activism uh, uh, is going to be very important. That we really need to cross the line between intellectual critique and activist resistance. And that's part of the lesson that I try to put out in this book, that, you know, that we have to take risks. There is no such thing as riskless activism, but it has to be an informed one that analyzes what we're up against and admits errors that were made, in order to be able to move forward and, to come to that appropriate formula of thought and action that can reverse the tide of far right-wing politics that we're all facing at this point in time. So, what can I say? There's no easy solution. There's no easy kind of strategy. It will be trial and error in many ways, but we've got to go through that process.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that great question, Tracy. Richard says, I have a question. Go for it, Richard.
Oh, hi. Thank you. Yeah, really just wanted to thank you for sharing today. I think I'm reflecting on your and appreciate your reflections on your journey, kind of your development as an activist, and also what you're saying about the importance of really being, I think, on the ground and out there, not just inside, you know. And then I'm also thinking about what you shared closer to the beginning of your sharing around the national democratic movement, and wanted to highlight that I think you were alluding to this, but the Filipinos are impacted still by some of the same issues that you were sharing about, including Filipinos overseas, around U.S. imperialism, influence, the government corruption that you were talking about, the dynasties, and of course the landlessness. And then also just wanted to plus one to what you said, that it really is the workers and peasants leading that fight in the Philippines. And still, with all of that, the National Democratic Movement is also still strong today, and it's drawing from the lessons that you were talking about, the victories from Philippine history, and as well as the allies that we've been able to make along the way. And I think an example of that is what you shared about Duterte's arrest. It was the ICC that arrested him, but that was the result of like the people's outcry, really, for justness of or justice for the 30,000 plus victims of Duterte. So wanted to uplift those points. And then my question is somewhat, could be related to this. It's a question from a student that wasn't able to make it today, but she was curious, where do you get your news? Yeah.
Where do I get my news?
Yes.
I'm in the Philippines, right? I'm based there. I'm based in the Philippines. I do investigation. I write. I have contacts all over. And I write what I think is the truth. So there's no substitute for being on the ground. And I'm on the ground in the Philippines.
Thanks for the question, Richard. That was a very librarian-ish question, asking about where people get their news. I'm always curious about that.
No,
Deep,
no, I think that it's a very important question because the Western media is oftentimes has its blinders and everything, but um, um, so it's very important that that uh, you know that journalists like those connected with Rappler in the Philippines. I write for Rappler a lot too, and we do have a fairly varied movement of citizens' resistance in the Philippines. It's not just the National Democratic Front. There are other sectors of the left. There are a very wide number of non-governmental organizations that are there. And this pluralistic opposition in the Philippines to what is happening in terms of the dynastic struggle between the Marcoses and the Dutertes is a very important part of the political scene at this point in the Philippines. So I just wanted to say that it's a plural movement in the Philippines, and it's not. And I think that pluralism is one of the strengths of of um, of the people's movements in the Philippines. But I think at this point, but I think we really ought to be also realistic that the progressive movement is not where it was at in the 1970s, and that it's struggling to get into the political process, and that there are various thinking about how the left can become relevant again in the way that it was relevant back in the 1970s and 1980s. And we just have to keep our ears on the ground and consult all different sectors, and so again, I would say that we need to keep our eyes and ears open. We filter in what's happening on the ground, but we also have an analysis through which we interpret the data, the political data that's out there. And one of the things that progressives have to do in the country, like they have to do in the United States and elsewhere, is they have to learn to work together. And sectarianism is just not going to hack it at this point in time. And I think just as in India, just as in the Philippines, just as in the United States and in Brazil, the one thing that this threat from the right is forcing us to do is to face us with the truth that unless we're able to get together and get out of our silos, we're not going to win.
Thank you for that addition to the question. I think we are running up to the end of our hour, but I want to bring in Deepa's question. Deepa, are you still there? Do you want to ask your question? Do you want me to read it?
I'm walking. Can you read it?
Yep, of course
Thanks.
I can. So Deepa says, thank you for speaking at our colleges today, Walden. As you shared your experience as an international student at Princeton in the early 70s, I thought about Mahmoud Khalil's recent disappearance by the Trump regime. What are your thoughts about Khalil's disappearance and Trump's rebranding of US imperialism?
Well, that's a terrible thing that has happened. I mean, that was exactly the kind of suppression of free speech that we cannot stand for. Mahmoud Khalil is, somebody who's, spoken the truth, about the genocide that's taking place. Okay, and he has legal status in the United States, and it's unforgivable what Trump has done. So that's one thing that I would just like to share. The other thing that I think it's really quite important is that one of the things that people like Mahmoud have basically said is that the Palestinian resistance is a valid is a widespread, diverse resistance, and one of and they're all valid resistance points. Okay? And not only him, but other people have made this statement, and so we cannot marginalize any movement from that resistance, including Hamas. Hamas is part of a very central part of the Palestinian resistance. Okay, and one cannot say that, hey, everything else is valid, but not Hamas. And I think there have been people in the United States that have said that and stated that, and basically, said, that we need to see the diversity of the resistance and not marginalize any group that's not that doesn't quite agree with your stance or values and that sort of thing. So again, I think his arrest just comes more and underlines the fact that all the more we should redouble our efforts against the genocidal campaign that is happening there in the Middle East. And I mean, yes, the Trump administration is fully behind Israel. And I think it is, in fact, our responsibilities to triple our efforts to just stop the arms sales or the arms that are going to support Israel's genocidal campaign. As to his rebranding of American imperialism, I don't know whether I have enough time to do that because, as Kathy said, that's. But the only thing that I can say is that this is a new era of defensive imperialism. And while Trump may talk aggressive rhetoric, the point is that the sort of global imperialism that saw threats to American interests everywhere in the world, and therefore the US had to intervene, I think that has now recognized the defeats that the US has suffered and is moving more to become some sort of a regional kind of imperialism in the Western Hemisphere, and is beginning to look at the world from a spheres of influence perspective. And some of the things that are happening here is Western Europe is now on its own. Okay? Eastern Europe is now seen as a sphere of influence of Russia. And the Asia Pacific increasingly is being seen by the United States as a sphere of influence of China. And so a lot of the old expectations we had are shifting at this point in time. But the important thing is to see it's a defensive phase of imperialism, and what Trump is engaged in is a fighting retreat. That part of which is to talk big, but really realize that there is a move towards isolationism in this country. So that has, so these are just my sense of the new conditions that are now on us. I wrote several things for the US press on the kind of isolationist trend within the United States. In fact, even before the Trump came to power. But I think this must not be, underestimated in terms of the way that it will affect what's happening, globally.
Well, thank you so much. I wish we had more time, and thank you for spending a little bit more time with us than we had asked you to. Thank you everyone for joining us. Look for the COSI website. Recordings will be there and additional resources. Mostly Walden, thank you. Thank you for coming to Seattle.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your wisdom. We will buy your book. Everyone should buy your book. And take care, safely travel back home. And I hope to see you again. How inspirational. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.